The kitchen clock was striking 2 p.m. when the phone rang. It was a quiet afternoon until then. I was sitting at the table, sipping a cup of tea and leafing through a book of old recipes from my grandmother, when the shrill sound of the phone interrupted the comfortable silence of my house. I answered on the third ring, without haste. "Hello?" My voice came out calm, without any foreboding of the whirlwind that was to come. "Mrs. Clark?" The voice on the other end was firm, professional, but there was a tone of urgency that made my heart race. "Yes, it's me. Who's this?" "This is the Central Hospital. Her husband, Mr. Clark, was in a serious accident and is in critical condition." The words echoed in my mind, each syllable carrying a weight I never imagined carrying. The phone almost slipped from my trembling hand. "What? What do you mean? What happened?" "The accident happened a short time ago. He is being treated, but needs to come to the hospital as soon as possible." I hung up the phone with a dry click, and the silence that followed was deafening. My thoughts were in chaos. Mark. My Mark. He was fine in the morning. I remember our hurried kiss at the door, as we always did. "See you later, love." And now he was fighting for life. I got up with a jerk, the chair scraping on the floor. My hands trembled so much that I could barely get my car keys. The house, once a haven of peace, now seemed to tighten around me. All I could think about was getting to him, being by his side. The road to the hospital has never seemed so long. Every red light, every slow-moving car was torture. My eyes burned with tears that refused to fall. Reality seemed like a nightmare from which I expected to wake up at any moment. Finally, I got to the hospital. I parked anyway and ran to the entrance. The automatic doors opened, revealing the cold, sterile reception. Everything there smelled of disinfectant and fear. Approaching the counter, my voice came out in a desperate whisper. "My husband, Mark Clark, he was in an accident. Where is he?" The receptionist, a young woman with a pitying look, typed something on the computer. "Emergency room, Ward C. Please follow that corridor." I walked hurriedly, almost tripping over my own feet. Each step echoed in the empty corridors, like an ominous prelude to what was to come. Arriving at the emergency room, I saw doctors and nurses in constant motion, a chaotic dance of life and death. The sight of Mark on the stretcher, surrounded by tubes and machinery, made my heart stop. My world, my everything, was there, fragile and vulnerable. The tears finally broke through the barrier and fell freely. "Mark," I whispered, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. I was there, and I wouldn't leave him alone. I held his cold hand and murmured promises, prayers, and supplications. As much as the pain tore me apart inside, I knew he needed me, and I would be there, every step, every beat, until he opened his eyes again. The hours passed slowly, each minute an eternity. I stood beside Mark, watching the rhythmic rise and fall of the monitors that kept him alive. The dawn was advancing, and I could barely feel the fatigue, sustained only by hope and fear. At about 3 in the morning, a doctor approached. His countenance was grave, and my heart sank at the sight of him. "Mrs. Clark," he began, and I felt a wave of dread run through my body. "We need to talk about your husband's condition." I stood up, still holding Mark's hand, as if my touch could keep him connected to me. I followed the doctor to a more reserved corner where he could speak without being interrupted. My stomach churned, and each step seemed to weigh a ton. "Your husband's condition is extremely serious," he said, his words meticulously chosen to convey the harsh reality. "We had to put him in a coma to try and stabilize his condition, but we can't guarantee when or if he will recover." I felt the ground disappear under my feet. "What do you mean? Him? He'll be fine, won't he? Are you doing everything you can?" "We are doing everything possible, but the situation is very delicate. We need to be realistic about the possibilities," he said, the compassion in his eyes almost unbearable. "There will be a team looking after him, but we need you to be prepared for any outcome." The words mingled in my mind, forming a whirlwind of despair. My world, which was already shaken, completely collapsed. I went back to Mark's side, feeling more helpless than ever. The silence of the dawn, punctuated only by the sounds of the machines, seemed to mock my anguish. I held her hand tightly, the tears finally falling uncontrollably. "Mark, you need to fight," I whispered, my voice broken by pain. "I can't lose you. Please come back to me." And there I stood, lost between hope and despair, trying to find strength amid the darkness that threatened to swallow up everything I knew and loved. The night passed without me being able to roll my eyes. I stood beside Mark, watching every movement of the apparatus, every ragged sigh. The darkness of the room seemed to reflect my soul, a thick layer of despair that did not allow me to find peace. When morning finally came, the first ray of sunshine through the window did not bring the relief I had hoped for. I got up, my legs trembling, and went to meet the doctor who had just entered the room. My heart was tight, and the need to do something, anything, was unbearable. "Please," I began, my voice choked. "You need to do something. He can't stay like this. My husband. You have to bring him back." The doctor looked at me with a mixture of compassion and professionalism. "We are doing our best, Mrs. Clark. The situation is very delicate, and we need time to see how he responds to treatments." "Time?" My voice rose a tone, urgency turning to despair. "But he needs help now. Me. I can't lose him." "I understand your pain," he said softly, "but the best thing you can do now is rest. Go home, get some sleep. This will help you and him too." I went home, but the suggestion to rest seemed insulting. How could I find peace while my husband was between life and death? The house, which was once a haven of love and joy, now seemed a strange place, empty without him. I collapsed on the couch, the sobs finally finding their way out. Through tears, I raised my eyes to heaven, my mind in a whirlwind of supplications and questions. "God," I whispered, "please give me a solution. I can't do this alone. Bring my husband back to me. He's all I have." With every prayer, with every desperate request, I hoped that a miraculous answer would come. Weariness finally took over, and I let myself be carried away by exhaustion, every fiber of my being crying out for hope in the midst of despair. That was just the beginning of my suffering. The days that followed were a blur of despair and loneliness. Each morning was a struggle to get out of bed, knowing that the day would be filled with hospital visits and news that never brought relief. Going to and from the hospital became my routine. The road there, which once seemed so long, was now a trail of sadness that I walked mechanically. I would come to Mark's room and sit next to him, holding his cold hand, hoping for some sign of recovery. But each day was the same as the last. Monitors beeping, nurses and doctors coming and going, and Mark motionless, trapped in that induced coma. The world outside those walls kept spinning, but for me, everything was suspended in a state of endless anguish. The people around me tried to be supportive, but their words of comfort could not penetrate the barrier of pain that enveloped me. Friends and family called, asked for news, but there was nothing to say. Time seemed to stand still, frozen in that moment of uncertainty. Every night, I came home feeling emptier. The house, which was once filled with laughter and conversation, now seemed an echo of past happiness. The silence was overwhelming, and Mark's memories were everywhere, in every object, in every corner. I often found myself wandering around the rooms, touching his things, as if I could feel his presence once again. The anguish of not knowing if he would return, if he would be the same again, consumed me. Each visit to the hospital was a confrontation with the brutal reality that nothing changed. The doctors did their best, but their expressions were more and more worried, their words more and more evasive. I cried out to God every night, looking for an answer, a miracle. Faith, which once sustained me, was now a battleground between hope and despair. "God, please help me," I whispered, the sound of my voice seeming insignificant in the face of the immensity of pain. And so, the days dragged on, an endless sequence of suffering and waiting, as the man I loved silently fought for life. It was a gray afternoon, the overcast sky perfectly reflecting my mood. She was sitting next to Mark, holding his inert hand, when a doctor entered the room. "Mrs. Clark," he said softly, "would you accompany me to my room? I'd like to discuss something important." My heart jumped. Something important. I got up, my hand reluctantly releasing Mark's, and followed the doctor through the cold corridors of the hospital. We arrived at his room, a sterile and impersonal environment, and he pointed me to a chair. I sat down, my hands trembling slightly in my lap. "There's something I'd like to discuss with you," he began, his voice calm and measured. "We know that your husband's situation is extremely delicate and that you have been going through a very difficult time. We want to offer a possible solution." I leaned forward, my mind swarming with questions. "Just say so," I replied, the anxiety in my voice evident. "We're working with a new technology, an advanced artificial intelligence," he continued, his eyes fixed on mine. "This AI allows you to create a virtual reality where the consciousness of patients can be transported. In other words, we could transfer Mark's consciousness into this virtual space, and you could join him. You could live together in that reality." The doctor's words floated in the air, surreal and almost unbelievable. Transporting Mark's consciousness and mine into a virtual reality. We could live together, as if nothing had happened. I stared at the doctor, trying to process what he had said. "Virtual reality?" I whispered, barely believing it. "Are you serious?" "Yes," he replied. "I understand that it sounds like something out of a science fiction film, but the advances in this area are real. It would be a way for you to be together, even if, physically, Mark remains in a coma." I didn't answer anything. The implications were huge, and the idea of living in an artificial reality with Mark was both tempting and frightening. The doctor continued to speak, explaining technical details, but his words were lost as I sank into thought. Could this be the solution I've been asking for so long? A way to be with Mark again, even if in an unconventional way? I looked at the doctor, trying to find some certainty in his eyes. But at that moment, all I felt was a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. I got up slowly, without saying a word, and went back to Mark's room. I needed time to think, to understand what this proposal really meant. Sitting next to him again, I held his hand and let the silence envelop both of us as my mind wrestled with the decision that could change our lives forever. Although I didn't give an immediate response to the AI proposal, the idea kept coming back to my mind incessantly. Each day unfolded in a painful repetition of comings and goings to the hospital, watching Mark in that state of suspension between life and death. Loneliness was my only companion now. The house remained silent, an empty capsule where my memories of happiness with Mark echoed in the dark corners. Friends and family tried to comfort me, but their words were like distant murmurs lost in the vastness of my despair. The thought of virtual reality was like a shadow that followed me wherever I went. Every moment I closed my eyes, I saw images of the possibility of being with Mark again, even if in a simulated way. A part of me desperately wanted to accept, to grab this chance to meet him again in some way. But another part hesitated, fearing the implications, the unknown that this technology could bring. The days dragged on, each with no noticeable difference from the previous one. The routine turned into an endless cycle of waiting and pain, and I found myself sinking into a sadness that had no end in sight. Each visit to the hospital was a confrontation with the harsh, unforgiving reality that Mark remained unreachable, trapped in a world where I couldn't follow him. The AI proposal hung over me like an uncertain promise, a door to a world I didn't fully understand. At night, when the silence became oppressive, I wondered if I could find comfort in a man-made reality, or if this was just an empty simulacrum of everything I loved about Mark. And so, between fragile hope and lingering fear, I carried on, caught in the web of a decision that could change everything, but that might also never lead me anywhere but to my own loneliness. The loneliness became unbearable. Every moment without Mark was an eternity of emptiness and pain. Finally, no longer enduring the separation, I decided to go to the doctor and express my desire to utilize the new AI. He smiled understandingly as I entered his room, the look reflecting a mixture of hope and caution. "Mrs. Clark," he said gently, "I was waiting for your decision." I explained to him my determination, my desire to be with Mark in any way possible. The doctor then led me through a detailed explanation of how the AI worked, the procedures involved, the risks and benefits. Every word was like a distant echo amid my urgency to make this decision. I signed the necessary documents, aware of the clauses and terms of the contract. The formalities seemed small in the face of the promise to be by Mark's side again. Each stroke of the pen on paper was a step towards the possibility of finding my love again, of recovering what life had cruelly taken from us. The doctor smiled again, a gesture of encouragement and understanding. "Let's start the process," he said, guiding me toward the next chapter of our journey. The wait was over. Now, I would face the unknown, driven by the hope that technology could bring us back together, even if in a world not physical, but as real as the love we shared. The wires were carefully connected, one around Mark's head, another around mine. As the technicians adjusted the final details, I felt a mix of conflicting emotions. My face showed a forced smile, but inside, my heart was beating out of whack. Fear was mixed with anxiety. Fear of the unknown, of what could happen when plunging into that artificial reality. Anxiety about finally being around Mark again, even if in such a different way than I could ever imagine. The doctor watched intently, his skilled hands moving with precision. "It's all set," he said finally, a tone of confidence in his voice. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Let's do it," I replied, my voice trembling. And then, the first signs of AI began to flow. A soft light filled my eyes, and the feeling of plunging into a new, unknown world overtook me. I closed my eyes, letting myself be carried away by the current of data and emotions that connected us. Time seemed to disappear as I saw myself emerging into a reality that seemed as real as the life I left behind. And there, among the lines of code and pixels that formed that virtual space, I found Mark. "Mark," I called, my heart racing as he turned to me, a smile lighting up his tired face. "Where are we?" He looked confused, his eyes searching to understand the environment around him. I smiled a little blandly, trying to find the right words to explain the inexplicable. "Mark, you had an accident," I began, my voice faltering slightly. "You are in a coma." His face twitched in shock, his eyebrows furrowing as he tried to process my words. "Eat," he repeated, as if the idea were still a distant and surreal concept. I nodded, holding his hand firmly. "Yes, you were in a coma, but we found a way to be together, somehow." I took a deep breath, gathering the courage to continue. "There is a new technology, an artificial intelligence that allows us to be here, in this place." Mark's eyes widened in surprise, a mixture of disbelief and fascination. "You mean we're together, because of an AI?" His voice charged with bewilderment. I explained to him more details about how AI worked, how it was possible for our minds to be connected in a reality that, although virtual, was as real in feelings and interactions as any physical experience. He listened intently, absorbing every word with a mixture of emotions. It was evident that the idea was difficult to accept, but at the same time, the promise of being together again was irresistible. That day we talked for many, many hours, as if we had been separated for centuries. Every moment was precious. Every word exchanged was a link that brought us together once again. But the time in virtual reality passed too quickly, and soon the inevitable moment came to turn off. I had to leave, leaving Mark in a digital slumber from which I longed so much to wake him up again. I promised him I'd be back soon. I held his hand for the last time, feeling the weight of love and uncertainty mixed in my chest. "Mark," I muttered in a choked voice, "I'm going back. I promise we will see each other again." His gaze met mine, filled with a confidence and a hope that I knew was grounded in the fragility of our virtual world. He smiled, a smile that warmed my soul even at parting. I slowly disconnected, feeling like I was leaving a part of me behind. Reality swallowed me again, but my heart remained in that place where Mark was waiting for me. Seeing Mark next to me, in that comatose state, was like reliving the pain the first time I saw him like this. I held back the tears, feeling a tightness in my chest that felt suffocating. The doctor, seeing my anguish, presented me with two difficult options. I could turn off the AI, and Mark probably wouldn't remember anything from our virtual reality encounter when I returned. Or I could keep it connected, leaving him in that space alone while I wasn't present. Doubts haunted me. I didn't know what would be best for him, what he would want me to do. With a trembling voice, I decided to keep the AI connected. "When I get back," I muttered to the doctor, I'll ask Mark what he prefers. Uncertainty hung over me, weighing like a dark cloud over my decision. I looked at Mark, wishing I could share my doubts with him, even if he was inert in his hospital bed. And so, I left him in that digital world that brought us together, while facing the real world where our lives were separated by a fine line between hope and despair. The next day I then told Mark what the doctors had told me and asked him what he would prefer. "Mark, are you okay here?" I asked, sitting down next to him. He smiled slightly, his eyes meeting mine tenderly. "Megan, I'd rather wait for you here than have to start over every day," he said, his soft voice laden with sad resignation. "Sometimes it seems that everything is so fleeting, except for these moments with you." I felt a pinch in my heart when I heard his words. I held his hand firmly, as if I could convey all my love and support through the digital connection. "Mark, I would also rather be with you here, every day," I replied sincerely. "You are my anchor, my reason for continuing." He sighed, a mixture of gratitude and melancholy in his gaze. "Then promise to come back," he urged, his eyes searching mine in silent supplication. "Promise that you will continue to be here, even when I am absent." "I promise, Mark," I murmured, feeling the tears form in my eyes. "I will be here every day that I can." And so, wrapped in the comfort of virtual reality, we faced together the uncertainty of tomorrow, clinging to those precious moments that only existed there, where love and technology intertwined in a fragile and ethereal embrace. My visits to the hospital were now marked by long dives into the AI, where I could finally be by Mark's side. In that virtual world, we could love each other, share moments that coma deprived us of in physical reality. However, even in this space where technology allowed a unique connection, something seemed to be missing. I watched Mark during our virtual meetings and felt that something was bothering him. His eyes, even reflected in pixels, expressed a sadness that he couldn't ignore, as if the very existence in that world was not enough to fill the void left by the real life that he was still missing. With each visit, the feeling of discomfort increased. I wanted to provide him with comfort, but the emotional complexity of the situation was becoming more and more apparent. I wondered if Mark was really happy in that AI-created reality, or if the illusion of our presence together only compounded his pain. Even so, I kept coming back, wishing that time could bring answers, that the love that united us could overcome the barriers, physical or virtual, that separated us. After several weeks immersed in the routine of virtual visits, I took courage to approach Mark about his impressions. "Mark, is something bothering you?" I asked softly, watching him as he contemplated the virtual landscape around us. He sighed deeply, looking away from me with a mixed expression of love and discomfort. "Megan, I love you so much, but to be here in a coma, to live in this space, it's weird. I feel like I'm stuck, like something essential is missing." I understood the depth of her anguish, feeling my heart tighten at her vulnerability. "I know it's not easy, Mark," I murmured, trying to find comforting words. "We're in this together. I will be here, every day." He looked at me, his blue eyes reflecting the sadness of his situation. "I know, Megan. Thank you for being here with me," he said sincerely. Our silence lingered for a moment, just the soft hum of simulation programs filling the space between us. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice echoing with a pent-up desire for hope. "I really want to be with you, Megan, but while this is not possible, it's worth seeing you here. I just ask you not to keep me waiting too long." His words penetrated deep into my heart, a mixture of gratitude and sadness settling in me. "Never, Mark," I promised firmly, holding his virtual hand affectionately. "I will be here every day I can. You are not alone." After that conversation, an additional weight settled on my heart. Every time I left the virtual environment and saw him in a coma next to me, the pain shook me deeply. I felt like I was trying to ease my own anguish without really considering Mark's true choice. It was a painful duality. While longing for his real presence, we knew that only in that digital space could we meet. If it wasn't that way, the possibility of never seeing each other again hung like a constant shadow over us. However, even in the face of this reality, one question persisted in my mind. To what extent was I being fair to Mark? He, trapped in a coma, unable to truly decide, while I navigated between the hope of his recovery and the fleeting comfort that virtual reality provided. Each visit to the AI became an act of love and despair, an attempt to keep our bond alive in a world where the line between the real and the simulated was painfully blurred. And deep down, we knew that our situation had no simple or quick solution. The uncertainty of the future hung over us, like a lurking storm. I wanted the best for Mark, for us, but facing reality was an almost unbearable task. As long as he remained there, stuck in that digital limbo, I would fight with all my might to be his anchor of hope and love, even if it meant carrying the weight of my own doubts and anxieties. Thus, between pain and devotion, between virtuality and reality, we moved on, together in our silent struggle against the limits imposed by life and technology. The moment came when I finally expressed to him everything that was weighing on my heart. The words came out between sobs as he held her hand firmly. Mark, with a look full of sadness and love, confessed to feeling the same tiredness as me. That was not reality, as much as we wanted it to be. His eyes, so full of life, now reflected the resignation of someone who is stuck in a limbo between life and coma. He asked me for forgiveness for wanting us to stop it. "Mark, you don't have to apologize for anything," I murmured, struggling to control the tears that were stubbornly falling. "I understand more than ever what you are going through." He shook my hand gently, seeking comfort in our quiet connection. "You know this might be the last time we see each other, don't you?" I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. His lips curved into a sad smile, the sincerest expression of love and pain I've ever seen. "Yes, I know," he whispered, stroking my face as if he wanted to memorize every detail. "But know that my love for you is eternal. Even if our paths part, I will still love you forever, even if I never see you again." I approached him, our hearts beating in unbroken sync. Our lips met in one last kiss, charged with longing and unspoken promises. In that fleeting instant, we knew we were saying goodbye to our love in the real world, but our bond would transcend whatever barrier life imposed. With a heavy heart, I left the AI room and headed to the doctor. He looked at me with compassion, knowing the weight of the decision I had just made. "Please turn off the AI," I asked, struggling to keep my composure as tears streamed down my face. The doctor nodded silently and went back to the control room. I took one last look at Mark, lying in his hospital bed, his face serene in the coma. I knew this was the final goodbye. I turned to leave, but stopped at the door, unable to leave him completely behind. "Goodbye, Mark," I whispered, the words escaping in a sigh charged with sadness and love. "You will always be with me." Visits to the hospital became less frequent over time. Mark remained stable. The doctors indicated that he could remain in that state indefinitely. Every time I walked into that room, I would hold back the crying, knowing there was nothing else I could do. The silence of the room was filled only by the soft sound of medical equipment, monitoring his condition. I held his hand, looking at his serene face, as if I were sleeping soundly. The days dragged on, and I tried to find comfort in the idea that, somehow, he was at peace. But the pain of impending loss still haunted me, making me wonder if I could ever feel complete again. Sometimes, in moments of loneliness, I would close my eyes and remember the happy days we spent together. It was like reliving a distant dream, a time when anything seemed possible. But now, the reality was more cruel than any nightmare. Each visit became a ritual of silent farewell. I said words of love and gratitude, knowing that Mark could not hear, but hoping that somehow he would feel my presence and my love. 2 years have passed since Mark fell into a coma. On a gloomy afternoon, I received a distressed call from the doctors. His words cut like sharp knives. "We're losing him. Would you like to come and say goodbye?" My heart raced. Without hesitation, I rushed to the hospital, hope and fear intertwining in my chest. I arrived panting, my mind a mess of thoughts. The corridors seemed longer than ever as I followed the hurried footsteps of the nurses to the room where Mark stood. As I entered, my gaze met his pale face, his quiet features contrasting with the bustle of the surrounding equipment. The doctors worked frantically, trying to stabilize him as I stood there, helpless, feeling time slip through my fingers. "I want to see you in AI," I muttered, my words barely audible under the tension in the air. Without hesitation, they led me to a reserved space, where they prepared me to once again enter that virtual reality. They plugged in the wires, adjusted the controls, and then I was there, again beside him, in the world created by technology. His eyes met mine, and I knew he felt my presence. Even though we were separated by a fine line between life and whatever came next, I held his hand virtually, letting the tears fall freely. "Mark," I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. He smiled, looking at me, as if he saw me for the first time. He did not know where he was nor everything that has happened in those last 2 years. And then he asked me, "Where are we?" And I told him, "We are here, together. We always will be." Thank you very much to those who have supported the channel financially through the link in the comment pinned. This helps me to bring more and more stories to you. And don't forget to like and also subscribe to continue receiving the new stories.